There's a strange clarity that comes when you've lost everything and find yourself staring at what's left. For Conrad Lee, that moment came at 61, alone on $20 worth of desert he'd bought at a county auction. Just dirt, thorns, and empty sky. No house, no business, no plan beyond surviving the night. He built a fire, laid out his bedroll, and fell asleep with his rifle close, half expecting nothing and no one. But dawn brought something he couldn't explain. A wild horse stood near the dying embers, watching him with an unsettling calm. It didn't run. It didn't shy away. It just stayed. And then it came back. What was it about this man and this barren place that kept drawing the horse closer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months before Conrad Lee found himself sleeping under desert stars, he'd owned a 3-bedroom house in Boulder Creek, California, ran a construction business that employed 12 people, and had been married to the same woman for 28 years. The house had a view of the redwoods. The business had a reputation for honest work and fair prices. The marriage had survived raising 2 children, 3 recessions, and the ordinary wear of nearly 3 decades together. Then it all came apart in the span of 11 months. The divorce papers sat in Conrad's glove compartment now, coffee-stained and dog-eared from the number of times he'd read them, trying to understand where it went wrong. The language was cold, legal, final. Irreconcilable differences. Division of assets. Custody arrangements. Though at 32 and 29, Laurel and Brent hardly needed custody arrangements anymore. What they needed, apparently, was to choose sides. Diane had chosen first. She'd been having an affair with Conrad's business partner, a man named Gordon Lee, who Conrad had known since they'd framed houses together in their 30s. Gordon, who'd been to their home for Christmas dinner. Gordon, who'd been Brent's godfather. Conrad found out the way these things always seem to happen in small towns. Someone saw them, told someone else, and eventually the truth arrived on his doorstep, wearing an uncomfortable expression. One of his workers, a young framer named Pete, had pulled him aside on a job site and said, "Boss, there's something you need to know." The confrontation had been brief. Diane didn't deny it. She said she'd been unhappy for years, that Conrad had always put the business first, that she'd felt invisible in her own marriage. Maybe some of that was true. Conrad had worked long hours, taken pride in building things that lasted, in providing well. But invisible. He'd thought they were building a life together. Gordon tried to apologize, said it just happened, that he never meant to hurt anyone. Conrad dissolved the partnership the next day. Within a month, Gordon had started his own company, taking 3 of Conrad's crew with him and underbidding him on every job. Within 3 months, Conrad's business was hemorrhaging money. The divorce proceedings dragged on. Lawyers extracted fees while Diane's attorney painted Conrad as an absent workaholic who'd neglected his family. His own lawyer, a tired man named Feldman, who seemed perpetually disappointed by humanity, advised him to settle. "You'll lose more fighting than giving in," Feldman said. So Conrad gave in. Diane got the house. The business equipment was liquidated to pay debts and legal fees. The retirement account they'd built together got split down the middle, leaving Conrad with barely enough to rent a studio apartment in a town 40 miles from anywhere he'd known. His daughter Laurel tried to stay neutral. She'd call occasionally, her voice careful, asking how he was doing in that tone people use when they already know the answer isn't good. She worked as a paralegal in Sacramento, had her own life, her own problems. Conrad didn't want to be another problem. His son Brent stopped calling altogether. At some point during the divorce, Brent had decided his father was at fault. Maybe Diane had convinced him. Maybe he'd come to that conclusion on his own. When Conrad tried to reach out, the conversations were brief and cold. "I'm busy, Dad. I've got to go." So Conrad found himself at 61 years old, divorced, estranged from his son, living in a 400-square-foot apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes, with $367 in his checking account and no clear path forward. That's when the insomnia started. Night after night, he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his neighbor's television through the thin walls, wondering how a life could unravel so completely. He'd get up at 2, 3 in the morning, make instant coffee, and sit at the small table under the fluorescent kitchen light, scrolling through his phone, looking for anything to distract himself from the silence. One night, he found himself on a county tax auction website. He wasn't sure how he'd gotten there, one link leading to another in the pre-dawn hours when everything feels slightly unreal. The auction listed properties throughout the western states, mostly abandoned lots and parcels with tax liens, being sold for whatever the county could get. Most were worthless, quarter-acre lots in dead mining towns, landlocked parcels with no road access, strips of land too narrow to build on, too remote to develop. But Conrad kept scrolling, and something about the photographs drew him in. Empty spaces, land that nobody wanted, places where a person could disappear if they needed to. He found it on page 17, 40 acres in southeastern Arizona, near the Mexican border. The listing was sparse. GPS coordinates, a grainy satellite photo showing nothing but beige earth and sparse vegetation, a note that the property had no utilities, no road access, and would require 4-wheel drive to reach. Minimum bid, $20. Conrad stared at the screen for a long time. $20 for 40 acres. It was absurd. It was probably a scam, or the land was so worthless even $20 was overpriced. But something about it called to him. A place that cost almost nothing. A place where no one would look for him. A place to start over, or at least a place to think about whether starting over was even possible. He placed the bid at 4 in the morning, sitting in his underwear at the kitchen table, drinking cold coffee, feeling slightly insane. No one else bid. 3 days later, he received an email confirming his purchase and a PDF of the deed. Conrad Lee owned 40 acres of Arizona desert. He spent a week researching the area, looking at maps, reading about the climate and the terrain. The property sat in a region of extreme heat and minimal rainfall, dotted with creosote bushes and prickly pear, home to rattlesnakes and scorpions, and not much else. The nearest town, Sunridge, had a population of 400 and was 40 miles away on roads that turned from pavement to gravel to dirt. It sounded perfect. He loaded his old Ford pickup with everything he owned that mattered, camping gear from a lifetime ago when he used to take the kids to the mountains, a Coleman stove, a sleeping bag, tarps, rope, basic tools, a 5-gallon water jug, and his father's rifle, a Winchester 94 that had belonged to his own father, August Lee, who'd raised Conrad on a small ranch in Wyoming before dying of a heart attack when Conrad was 19. He didn't tell anyone he was leaving. He texted Laurel, "Taking some time away. I'm fine. We'll call soon." He didn't text Brent. Then he drove east. The drive took 2 days. Conrad pushed through California's Central Valley, crossed into Arizona near Yuma, then headed southeast into country that grew increasingly empty. The interstate gave way to state highways, then county roads, then routes that barely deserved the name. Towns appeared and disappeared in his rearview mirror, each one smaller than the last. He stopped once in a place called Copper Ridge to fill up on gas and buy supplies. The attendant, a leathery man in his 70s, studied Conrad's California plates with open curiosity. "Passing through?" he asked. "Staying," Conrad said. The man nodded slowly, like he'd heard that before, and knew how it usually ended. "Well, you picked a hell of a place for it. Gets to 115 in the summer. Lucky it's only April." Conrad paid in cash, bought 6 gallons of drinking water, canned goods, batteries, and left without further conversation. He reached his property 2 hours before sunset. The GPS coordinates led him off the paved road onto a track that was barely visible, 2 ruts in the hardpan separated by a strip of dried grass. He drove slowly, the truck bouncing over rocks and dips, until the track disappeared entirely and he was simply driving across open desert, following the coordinates on his phone. When he reached the boundary markers, a few rusted posts that someone had placed decades ago, he stopped the truck and stepped out into the silence. It hit him immediately, that silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of it. Wind moving through creosote branches, the distant cry of a hawk, the tick of his truck's engine cooling. He'd lived his entire adult life surrounded by noise, construction sites, traffic, television, other people's conversations bleeding through apartment walls. Here, there was nothing but space and air and the vast indifference of the land. His 40 acres stretched in every direction, indistinguishable from the surrounding desert except for those ancient property markers. To the north, a line of rocky hills rose against the sky. To the south, the land flattened toward Mexico, invisible beyond the heat shimmer. East and west, more of the same. Pale earth, scattered vegetation, the occasional saguaro standing like a sentinel. It was beautiful in a harsh way. Honest. Nothing here pretended to be something it wasn't. Conrad walked the perimeter as the sun began its descent, his boots crunching on ground that might not have felt human footsteps in years. He found evidence of previous habitation, a few weathered fence posts marking what might have been a property line, a rusted tin can half buried in sand, a piece of rotted wood that could have been part of a structure once. Someone had tried to claim this place before him. Someone had failed. He should have found that discouraging, but instead it felt oddly comforting. He wasn't the first person to run toward emptiness, hoping to find something worth keeping. As the sun touched the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, Conrad chose a spot for his camp, a flat area near the northern edge of his property, sheltered slightly by a formation of rocks that would provide windbreak. He unloaded his gear, moving with the efficient motions of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. He cleared the ground of rocks and debris, set up his tent, arranged his supplies. He built a small fire ring from stones he gathered, then collected dead wood from the creosote bushes, brittle branches that snapped easily and would burn hot and quick. By the time full darkness arrived, he had a fire going and coffee brewing in a battered pot balanced on rocks at the edge of the flames. He sat on his sleeping mat, the rifle lying beside him, more out of habit than fear, and watched the fire dance while the desert cooled around him. The stars emerged slowly, then all at once. Without light pollution, the sky transformed into something primordial. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. Constellations his grandfather had taught him appeared. Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper pointing toward Polaris. Conrad Lee had owned a small ranch outside Laramie, 500 acres of grassland, where he'd raised cattle and horses with the kind of quiet competence that Conrad had admired as a boy. Summer visits had meant early mornings, checking fence lines, afternoons learning to ride, evenings sitting on the porch while August smoked his pipe and talked about the land, about respect for animals, about the difference between loneliness and solitude. "Loneliness is wanting something you don't have," August had said once. "Solitude is appreciating what you do." Conrad hadn't understood it then. At 14, solitude had seemed like punishment. Now, at 61, it felt like possibility. He sipped his coffee, black and bitter, and tried to inventory what he felt. Not happiness, exactly. Not peace. Something more like resignation, mixed with faint curiosity. He'd come here because he had nowhere else to go, but also because something in him needed to know if he could still build something from nothing. The fire crackled and popped. Embers rose toward the stars. The temperature dropped steadily. Desert nights were cold, even in April, and Conrad wrapped himself in a wool blanket he'd owned since his 20s. Tomorrow he'd explore the property more thoroughly. He'd find the spring he'd read about in the Geological Survey, see if the water was drinkable. He'd start planning what came next, if anything came next. But tonight, he just sat and breathed and existed in a space where no one expected anything from him. The fire burned down to coals. Conrad added a few more pieces of wood, enough to last until morning, then arranged his bedroll close to the warmth. He placed the rifle within easy reach, not because he expected trouble, but because that's what his grandfather would have done. He lay back and looked up at the infinite scatter of stars, feeling small in a way that was somehow comforting. Out here, his divorce didn't matter. His failed business didn't matter. The estrangement from his son, the careful distance from his daughter, the apartment that smelled like smoke, none of it mattered. Out here, he was just one more creature trying to survive the night. Sleep came slowly, fitfully. The ground was hard beneath his sleeping pad. Strange sounds drifted through the darkness, animal calls he couldn't identify, the rustle of something moving through brush, the distant yip of coyotes. But eventually, exhaustion won, and Conrad drifted into unconsciousness with the smell of smoke in his clothes and the vast Arizona night pressing down like a blessing. He didn't know that when he woke, everything would be different. He didn't know that he was not alone. 3 days passed in a rhythm that Conrad hadn't experienced since childhood summers on his grandfather's ranch. He woke with the sun, made coffee over the rekindled fire, and watched the desert come alive in the early light. The horse, he'd started calling her Rust for the reddish tint in her dun-colored coat, returned each morning and again at dusk, keeping her. Distance, but maintaining a presence that felt increasingly deliberate. On the morning of the 4th day, Conrad discovered something unexpected while rummaging through his truck's glove compartment for a map. His fingers closed around a familiar shape, and he pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch, tarnished and silent. He'd forgotten it was there, tucked away years ago after the divorce proceedings began, when he'd gathered the few family heirlooms he wanted to protect from the asset division. The watch had stopped at 3:47, the exact time August Lee had died 23 years ago. Conrad had been the one to find him, slumped in his chair on the ranch house porch, the pipe still clenched between his teeth. "Heart attack," the coroner said. "Quick and clean." August would have appreciated that. Conrad turned the watch over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the inscription on the back worn almost smooth. To August, with love. Margaret, 1962. His grandmother had given it to his grandfather on their 20th anniversary, just 2 years before she died of cancer. After that, August had lived alone on the ranch for 15 years, content with his cattle and his horses and the land. Sitting by the morning fire, Conrad wondered if August had felt this same strange mixture of grief and possibility when Margaret died. Had he questioned whether life alone was worth living? Had he found his answer in the daily work, the patient tending of animals, the slow passage of seasons? Rust appeared then, earlier than usual, stepping into view from behind the rock formation that had become her preferred approach. She was closer today, maybe 20 feet away, her dark eyes fixed on Conrad with an intensity that felt almost human. "Morning," Conrad said softly, the way he'd taken to greeting her. "You're early." The horse's ears flicked forward at his voice. She took 2 steps closer, then stopped, nostrils flaring as she tested the air between them. Conrad had been leaving water out for her in a plastic tub, though he suspected she had her own sources somewhere on the property. Still, she'd started drinking from the tub each evening, a small ritual that felt like trust building in increments. He'd also started talking to her. At first it felt foolish, a grown man narrating his thoughts to a wild animal, but the sound of his own voice helped organize the chaos in his head, and Rust seemed to listen. She'd tilt her head slightly when he spoke, one ear always pointed in his direction. "Found my grandfather's watch this morning," Conrad said now, holding it up, though Rust couldn't possibly understand the gesture. "Stopped the day he died. I thought about getting it fixed once, but then I figured maybe it was right to leave it. Some things aren't meant to keep going." Russ took another step closer. 15 feet now. "He raised horses, my grandfather. Had this paint mare named Dolly who was smarter than most people I've known. She'd open gates if you didn't, latch them right, knew when bad weather was coming before the sky even changed. August used to say animals know things we've forgotten how to notice." The horse lowered her head slightly, ears still forward, attentive. "He also said animals can sense when you're hurting. Said they can smell it on you, or feel it in the air around you. I used to think that was just ranch philosophy, the kind of thing old-timers say." Conrad paused, studying Rust's calm stance, the way she'd chosen to stay rather than bolt. But maybe he was right. Maybe you know I'm hurting. Maybe that's why you keep coming back. The words hung in the desert air. Conrad felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there for months. He hadn't admitted to anyone, not even Laurel, how completely the divorce had gutted him, how some mornings he'd woken up in that awful apartment and couldn't remember for a few seconds why he was there, why everything was wrong. Rust moved closer still. 10 feet, close enough that Conrad could see the scars on her legs, old barbed wire wounds probably, the kind that wild horses collected over years of surviving in harsh country. She bore them without self-pity, badges of endurance. "I lost almost everything," Conrad continued, his voice quieter now. "House, business, family. Thought I knew who I was. A husband, a father, a builder. Turns out I was wrong about all of it. Or maybe I was right once, and then forgot how to be those things. Either way, I don't know who I am anymore." The horse stood still, breathing steadily, and Conrad had the strange sensation that she understood perfectly. Not the words, but the weight behind them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jarring against the moment's stillness. Rust's head jerked up, and she took 3 quick steps backward. Conrad cursed softly, pulling out the phone. Laurel's name glowed on the screen. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but guilt won out. "Hey, sweetheart." "Dad." Her voice carried relief and worry in equal measure. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. Sorry, reception's spotty out here." "Out where, exactly? Your last text said you were taking time away, but that was almost 2 weeks ago." "I've been worried." Conrad watched Rust retreat to a safer distance, settling at about 30 feet. Still visible, still present, but wary now. I'm in Arizona. Bought some land. A pause. You bought land. With what money? $20 at a tax auction. 40 acres of desert. Another pause. Longer this time. Dad, are you okay? I mean, really okay? I'm fine, Laurel. Better than fine, actually. I'm just... He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insane. I'm figuring things out. By hiding in the desert. I'm not hiding. I'm starting over. That's what hiding looks like sometimes. Her voice softened. I know the divorce was hard. I know Mom and Gordon. I know all of it was awful. But disappearing isn't the answer. Conrad felt a flash of frustration. I'm not disappearing. I'm right here. I know exactly where I am. Do you? It wasn't accusatory, just sad. Because from here, it looks like you're running away from everything. Maybe, Conrad admitted. Or maybe I'm running toward something. I don't know yet. They talked for a few more minutes, Laurel trying to extract promises that he'd stay in touch, that he'd come back if things got bad, that he'd at least consider that living alone in the desert might not be the healthiest response to trauma. Conrad gave her enough reassurance to end the call without her threatening to drive out herself. When he hung up, Rust had vanished. He sat for a long time, holding the dead pocket watch, feeling the familiar weight of inadequacy settle over him. Even his daughter thought he was broken, running, hiding. Maybe she was right. But then, as the sun climbed higher and the temperature began its daily rise, Rust reappeared. She walked straight to the water tub, drank deeply, then lifted her head and looked at him. Just looked, for a long moment that felt like forgiveness or understanding or simple acknowledgement that he was still there. Conrad stood slowly, pocketed the watch, and smiled for the first time in days. "Thank you," he said to the horse. She flicked her tail and walked away, but not far, just to the edge of camp, where she could keep watch. By the start of the second week, Conrad's supplies had dwindled to the point where a trip to town became necessary. The realization brought an unexpected anxiety. He'd fallen into a routine with Rust. Mornings and evenings, her visits as reliable as the sunrise, and leaving felt like breaking an unspoken agreement. He loaded up at dawn, before her usual arrival time, leaving extra water in the tub and a pile of the dried grass she seemed to favor from near the rock formation. It felt foolish, preparing for a horse's visit like she was a house guest, but he did it anyway. The drive to Sunridge took 90 minutes over roads that deteriorated from bad to worse. The town appeared suddenly out of the desert, a cluster of low buildings huddled against the wind. Population 400, the faded sign declared, though Conrad suspected that number was optimistic. Main Street consisted of 6 blocks of sun-bleached storefronts. Half were empty, windows papered over or broken. The survivors included a gas station, a diner, a post office, and a general store that looked like it had been there since Arizona achieved statehood. Conrad parked in front of the general store, feeling immediately conspicuous. His California plates drew stares from the handful of people on the street. He'd grown a beard in the past 2 weeks. His clothes were dusty, and he probably looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd been living rough in the desert. Inside, the store was dim and crowded, every shelf packed with goods that ranged from canned food to hardware to veterinary supplies. The smell of old wood and dust reminded Conrad of August's ranch, of summer afternoons spent in the barn organizing tack. An old man stood behind the counter, 70-something, with skin like weathered leather and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who'd spent generations in the desert. "Need supplies," Conrad said. "Food, mostly. Some batteries. Rope, if you've got it." The man nodded toward the aisles. Help yourself. Everything's marked. Conrad gathered what he needed, moving slowly through the narrow aisles. Canned beans, rice, coffee, jerky, more batteries for his flashlight. He added a can of WD-40, some wire, a pair of work gloves to replace the ones he'd torn on barbed wire remnants. At the counter, the old man rang up each item on a register that might have been from the 1970s. Camping? He asked casually. Living, Conrad corrected. Bought property east of here. 40 acres. The man's hands paused over the register keys. He looked up, eyes narrowed. East of here? How far? About 40 miles, near the old survey marker at mile 47. Something shifted in the man's expression. Recognition, or maybe concern. That cursed patch, he said quietly. Excuse me? The man resumed ringing up items, but his movements had become deliberate, careful. That land's got history. Bad history. You the fellow bought it at the county auction. I am. Conrad Lee. He extended his hand. The old man shook it with a grip still strong despite his age. Hank Castillo. I run this place, such as it is. He bagged the supplies, then leaned on the counter. That land belonged to a man named Vernon Steele. Hermit type. Lived out there alone for years, trying to build something. Then one day he was just gone. Sheriff found him 3 weeks later, dead of a heart attack. Animals had been at him. Conrad felt a chill despite the store's stuffy warmth. I found some old fence posts out there. Figured someone had tried homesteading. Vernon tried more than homesteading. He had dreams. Hank's voice carried an edge of sadness. Wanted to make a sanctuary, he said. Place for wild horses. Spent every dollar he had on that land. Lived in a tent for 2 years while he worked it. Then his heart gave out, and the desert took back everything he'd built. What happened to his things? His camp? Time happened. Wind. Weather. Desert doesn't leave much behind. Hank handed over the bags. That'll be $73. Conrad paid, but hesitated before leaving. The horses. Are there still wild horses out there? Hank's expression became unreadable. Might be. Mustang populations move around. BLM does round up sometimes, but they miss plenty. Why? You seen one? Maybe, Conrad said carefully. A mare. Dun-coloured, reddish tint. Something flickered across Hank's face. Surprise, or recognition. She comes around, does she? Every day. Hank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Vernon used to talk about a horse like that. Called her his guardian angel. Said she appeared right after he bought the land, like she knew he belonged there. He was half crazy by the end, mind you. Isolation does things to a man. Conrad thought about his conversations with Rust, the way he'd started organizing his thoughts by speaking them aloud to an animal that couldn't respond. Maybe, he said. Word of advice? Hank leaned forward. That land has taken more than it's given. If you're smart, you'll sell it and move somewhere with people, with life. Desert's no place to be alone. Conrad nodded his thanks and left, but the warning sat heavy in his chest during the long drive back. He returned in late afternoon to find Rust waiting near his camp, standing by the rock formation in a patch of shade. When she saw his truck, her head lifted, ears forward, and something in Conrad's chest loosened. She'd waited. She'd stayed. He unloaded supplies quickly, wanting to establish his presence before dark. Rust watched from her usual distance, and Conrad fell back into the rhythm of talking to her while he worked. Met a man in town named Hank. He told me about Vernon Steele, the man who owned this land before me. Died out here alone. He stacked cans in the plastic bin he used for a pantry. Hank thinks I'm crazy for staying. Maybe I am. But you know what's strange? I feel more sane here than I did in that apartment, lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering what I did wrong. Rust moved closer, drawn by his voice, or perhaps by simple curiosity. Hank said Vernon talked about a horse, a guardian angel, he called her. Was that you? Or your mother, maybe? Conrad straightened, studying the mare. Doesn't matter, I suppose. Point is, Vernon tried to build something here and failed. Died trying. That should scare me more than it does. He opened a can of beans for dinner, eating them cold while the sun descended. Rust grazed nearby on the sparse vegetation, comfortable enough now that his presence didn't disturb her feeding. As darkness gathered, Conrad built up the fire and settled in with his sleeping bag. Rust remained visible at the edge of the firelight, a solid presence against the vast emptiness. "I'm not Vernon," Conrad said into the darkness. "I'm not trying to build a sanctuary or prove anything. I just needed a place to figure out who I am now that everything else is gone." "That's different, isn't it?" The horse's ears swiveled toward his voice. "I hope that's different," Conrad whispered. The storm came 3 days later, announced by a shift in the wind and a peculiar quality to the light that made the distant mountains look closer than they were. Conrad had been reinforcing his tent stakes when he noticed dark clouds building on the western horizon, moving fast. Rust appeared earlier than usual, trotting into camp with an urgency Conrad hadn't seen before. She circled once, head high, then positioned herself behind the rock formation, tucking into the sheltered side. "Smart girl," Conrad muttered, hurrying to secure his supplies. The wind hit first, gusting hard enough to snatch his hat and send it tumbling across the desert. He let it go, focused on getting tarps over his gear, weighing everything down with rocks. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. Lightning flickered in the dark clouds, followed by the deep roll of thunder. Then the rain came, not the gentle patter Conrad remembered from California, but a violent deluge that turned the air grey and hammered the earth. Within minutes, dry washes began running with water, transforming the landscape into a network of temporary streams. Conrad huddled in his tent, listening to the canvas snap and strain, wondering if the stakes would hold. Through the opening, he could see Rust, still sheltered behind the rocks, head lowered against the wind, water streaming off her coat. She could have run, found better shelter elsewhere, but she stayed. The storm passed after an hour, leaving the desert transformed. Water pooled in every depression. The creosote bushes gleamed wet and green. The air smelled clean, almost sweet. Conrad emerged to assess the damage. His camp had held mostly. One corner of the tent had pulled loose, and some supplies had gotten wet, but nothing critical was lost. He looked toward the rocks and found Rust standing in the open now, shaking water from her mane. Their eyes met across 30 feet of wet earth, and Conrad felt a strange kinship with this animal who'd weathered the same storm, who'd chosen to endure it here rather than flee to easier ground. "We made it," he called to her. She nickered softly, the first sound he'd heard her make. Over the next several days, Conrad began exploring his property more systematically, and Rust began following him. Not close, but present, maintaining 50 feet or so while he walked the boundaries, examined the terrain, tried to understand what he'd actually bought for $20. It was during one of these explorations, along the northern edge of his land, that his boot struck something metallic. He knelt and brushed away sand, revealing a rusted metal box about the size of a toolbox, half buried and sealed with a corroded padlock. Conrad glanced back at Rust, who'd stopped to watch. "What do you think?" He worked the box free, carried it back to camp, and spent 20 minutes with a hacksaw cutting through the old lock. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had mostly kept the contents dry, he found a journal, some photographs, and a hand-drawn map. The journal's cover was water-stained leather, the pages yellowed but readable. On the first page, in careful handwriting, Property Log, Vernon Steele, March 2008. Conrad settled by the evening fire and began to read. The early entries showed a man filled with purpose and hope. Vernon had bought the land after losing his house to foreclosure, after his family had fractured, after decades of what he called living wrong. The parallels to Conrad's own story were unsettling. March 15th, 2008. Slept under stars last night. First time in 40 years I felt like I could breathe. This land may be nothing to anyone else, but it's mine. Clean slate. New start. The entries continued, documenting Vernon's efforts to build a basic shelter, his plans for collecting rainwater, his observations about the desert. Then, on April 3rd, a different tone emerged. She appeared this morning, a copper-colored mare, wild but unafraid. She stood at the edge of my camp and just watched me. I've never believed in signs, but if I did, this would be one. August, that's what I'll call her, after the month my son was born. August represents possibility. Conrad's breath caught. August, his grandfather's name. The coincidence felt heavy, meaningful. He read on. Vernon's entries became increasingly focused on the horse, on his attempts to understand why she kept returning, on his growing conviction that the land itself was special somehow, that it needed protecting. June 12, 2009. Spent all day researching conservation easements. If I can prove this land is critical habitat, I can protect it permanently. August shows me new things every day. The spring in the North Canyon, the old petroglyphs, the paths the other Mustangs use. This isn't just my land. It belongs to something larger. But then the entries began to darken. References to surveyors appeared, mentions of developers interested in the surrounding parcels, fears about losing the land. March 8, 2010. They won't leave me alone. Letters, phone calls, men showing up uninvited. They want this land for their resort, their golf course, their vision of what desert should be. Tamed, comfortable, profitable. They don't understand. August understands. She's been skittish for weeks, knows something's wrong. The final entries were brief, almost frantic. April 2nd, 2010. Threats now, not even subtle. Accidents happen to stubborn old men in the desert. But I won't sell. I can't. This is her home. April 15th, 2010. August hasn't come in 3 days. I'm scared I've driven her away, that my presence here has done more harm than good. April 19th, 2010. She's back. I cried when I saw her. Must protect this place. Must find a way. The journal ended there, mid-page, as if Vernon had been interrupted and never returned to writing. Conrad looked up from the pages to find full darkness had fallen. Rust stood at the edge of the firelight, her coat gleaming copper in the flames, and Conrad felt the weight of understanding settle over him. Not August. Rust was probably August's daughter, born wild after Vernon died, carrying some genetic memory of this place, of safety found here. He examined the photographs next. Vernon had been a thin man with kind eyes and weathered hands. In several photos, a copper mare stood in the background, ears forward, watching. In one, a younger man stood beside Vernon, maybe in his 20s, holding the mare's lead rope. The handwriting on the back read, Philip and Morning Star, 1995. Conrad stared at that date. 1995 was 13 years before Vernon bought this land. What did it mean? The hand-drawn map showed features Conrad recognized, the rock formation, the rough boundaries, and some he didn't. A spring marked in the North Canyon, an area labeled Sanctuary Point, notations about wildlife corridors and water sources. Vernon hadn't been crazy. He'd been trying to save something worth saving. Conrad looked at Rust again. This wild horse who'd chosen to return day after day to land that her mother, or grandmother, had once known as safe. He failed, Conrad said softly. But maybe I don't have to. Conrad woke the next morning with Vernon's map spread across his sleeping bag and a plan forming in his mind. If the spring marked on the map actually existed, it would explain how Rust survived out here. More importantly, it might explain why this land mattered beyond his own need for solitude. He found Rust grazing near camp and spoke to her while making coffee. "What do you say we go exploring today? Your mother knew this place. Maybe you do too." The mare lifted her head, ears swiveling toward his voice. Conrad packed water, the map, and his phone, then set out north toward the canyon Vernon had marked. Rust followed at her usual distance, but as they walked, that distance gradually shrank. By the time they'd covered a mile, she was only 20 feet behind him, close enough that he could hear her hooves crunching on the rocky ground. The canyon appeared suddenly, a crack in the earth hidden by the landscape's subtle rolls and dips. Conrad almost walked past it before noticing the change in vegetation. Greener plants, denser growth. He approached the edge carefully and looked down into a narrow gorge about 15 feet deep. Water. A thin stream ran along the canyon floor, fed by a spring that bubbled up between rocks at the far end. It wasn't much, but in this desert it was everything. He found a way down, half climbing, half sliding over loose rock. At the bottom, the temperature dropped several degrees. The spring water was cold and clear, pooling in a natural basin before trickling away through the sand. Conrad cupped his hands and drank. It tasted mineral-rich but clean. Rust appeared at the canyon's edge above him, then picked her way down with the sure-footedness of an animal who'd made this descent many times before. She went straight to the pool and drank deeply, confirming what Conrad had suspected. This was her water source, probably had been for years. While Rust drank, Conrad explored the canyon walls and discovered something that made him catch his breath. Petroglyphs, dozens of them, etched into the rock face. Horses, human figures, spirals and symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. Some looked ancient, others more recent. Near the bottom, carved in rougher strokes, were the initials PC 1994. Philip, Conrad thought, the young man in Vernon's photograph. He sat on a flat rock near the pool, watching Rust, trying to piece together the story. This place had been significant long before Vernon, maybe for centuries. The petroglyphs proved that. Somehow, Vernon had known about it, had brought his son here, and years later had returned, trying to protect it. His phone buzzed, barely one bar of reception, but enough for messages to trickle through. 3 texts from Laurel, increasingly worried. One from a number he didn't recognize. He opened the unknown number first. "Mr. Lee, this is Gregory Pendleton with Red Rock Ventures. We're developing properties in your area and would like to discuss purchasing your parcel. Very interested. Please call at your convenience." Conrad stared at the message. Red Rock Ventures. He thought of Vernon's journal entries about developers, about threats and pressure. He called Laurel instead. "Dad, finally. I've been worried sick. I'm fine. Sorry, reception is terrible out here. You need to come home." Her voice carried an edge of desperation. "Or at least to somewhere with actual civilization. I looked up that property. It's in the middle of nowhere, Dad. What are you doing?" "Living," Conrad said. "Learning. I found something out here, Laurel. Something that matters." "A pile of sand matters?" "It's more than that." He struggled to explain. "There's a spring, ancient petroglyphs, wildlife. The man who owned this before me, Vernon Steele, he was trying to protect it. I think that's why he died here. He wouldn't give up, Silence on the other end. Then, "Dad, you're scaring me. You sound like what? Like someone who's been alone too long." Her voice softened. "Please, just come back for a few days. Let me see you. Make sure you're okay. Then if you want to go back, at least I'll know you're making that choice clearly." Conrad watched Rust drink from the spring, this wild creature who'd chosen to trust him incrementally, day by day. "I'll think about it," he said. "But Laurel, I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" He didn't answer right away. Did he? Or was he just running, like she'd suggested, hiding from failure behind the excuse of new purpose? "I'm figuring it out," he said finally. After the call ended, another text appeared from his son. "Mum says you bought desert land with your last money. Real smart, Dad. Real responsible. Some of us have to live in the real world." Conrad closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of Brent's anger. His son had been 29 when the divorce started, old enough to form his own opinions, but young enough to still need his parents to be stable, reliable. Instead, he'd watched his father lose everything and retreat to nowhere. Maybe Brent was right. Maybe this was irresponsible, selfish even. But something about this place felt necessary in a way Conrad couldn't articulate. He typed back, "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But I need this time. I'm not abandoning you. I'm trying to find myself again." He deleted it without sending. What was the point? Brent wouldn't understand, wouldn't want to understand. Rust finished drinking and moved to a patch of shade, settling down with her legs tucked beneath her. Conrad took photos of the petroglyphs, the spring, the mare resting peacefully in this hidden place. Then he climbed back out of the canyon and sat at the edge, looking out over his 40 acres of desert that suddenly felt like more than just empty land. His phone buzzed again. Gregory Pendleton had sent another text. "Mr. Lee, we're prepared to offer $15,000 for your property. That's a 75,000% return on your investment. Please respond at your earliest convenience." $15,000. It was more money than Conrad had in the bank, more than enough to rent a real apartment, start over somewhere comfortable. It was the smart choice, the reasonable choice. But Vernon had been pressured to sell, and Vernon had refused, and Vernon was dead. Conrad thought about the journal entries, about threats and harassment. He thought about this spring that supported life, about petroglyphs that marked centuries of significance, about a wild horse who returned every day to the only place she knew as home. He looked at the text for a long moment, then turned off his phone and slipped it into his pocket. Some things weren't for sale. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Below him in the canyon, Rust stood and shook herself, then looked up at him with what Conrad chose to interpret as approval. "Yeah," he said to her. "I know." Conrad spent the next 3 days ignoring calls and texts from the Red Rock Ventures number. Meanwhile, he studied Vernon's journal more carefully, paying attention to details he'd missed in the first reading. One entry kept nagging at him. "Philip won't forgive me, but maybe this place will speak for me when I'm gone." The photograph of the young man, Philip, standing beside the copper mare, kept drawing Conrad's attention. The date, 1995, bothered him. Vernon hadn't bought this land until 2008. How had Philip been here 13 years earlier? On the 4th morning, Conrad drove back to Sunridge with the photograph in his pocket. He found Hank Castillo sweeping the porch of his general store, the old man moving with the slow deliberation of someone who had all day and knew it. "Back already?" Hank said, leaning on his broom. "Forget something?" "Information," Conrad said. He pulled out the photograph, You knew Vernon Steele. Do you know this young man? Hank took the photo, and his weathered face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, then something like pain. His hands trembled slightly as he held the image. Where did you find this? His voice was rough. Buried on the property in a metal box. Vernon's journal was inside too. Hank was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, weighted with old grief. That's my nephew, Philip Castillo. Conrad felt something shift in his understanding. Vernon's journal mentioned someone named Philip, called him his son. He was. Hank handed back the photograph and sat heavily on a wooden bench outside the store. Vernon Steele was Philip's biological father. Not that Vernon earned the title. He was a drunk for most of Philip's childhood, in and out of jobs, in and out of their lives. Philip's mother, my sister Rita, she finally left him when the boy was 12. Smart woman. Should have done it sooner. But this photo is from 1995. Philip looks like a teenager here. Hank nodded. 15, 16, maybe. That was Vernon's one good year. He got sober, got steady work as a ranch hand outside of Tucson. The horse in that picture, Morning Star, she belonged to the ranch. Vernon was helping gentle the wild horses they'd captured, and Philip would visit sometimes. The boy had a gift with animals, always had. He and that copper mare formed a real bond. Conrad thought of Rust, drinking from the spring. What happened to Morning Star? Vernon bought her when the ranch was selling off stock. Spent money he shouldn't have, but he wanted to give Philip something meaningful. For a while, things were good between them. Then Vernon fell off the wagon, lost his job, couldn't keep the horse properly. Had to let her go. Turned her loose in the desert rather than sell her to slaughter. Philip never forgave him for that. So when Vernon bought the land years later, he was trying to make amends. Hank finished. Bought that property thinking maybe he could create something lasting, something that would prove to Philip he'd changed. He found Morning Star out there, or she found him. Wild again, but still alive. Vernon saw it as a sign, thought if he could protect her, protect the land, maybe Philip would see he'd finally gotten it right. Conrad felt the pieces clicking into place. Did Philip ever come see what Vernon was building? Hank's expression darkened. No. Philip refused every invitation, every plea. Said he was done being disappointed by his father. Vernon kept trying, though, kept writing letters that Philip wouldn't answer. Then Vernon died out there alone, and Philip, the old man's voice, cracked. Philip has carried that guilt ever since. Where is Philip now? Works as a farrier, travels around to the ranches. Good man despite everything, or maybe because of it. Makes a point of being reliable, showing up when he says he will, being the opposite of what his father was. Hank studied Conrad. Why are you asking about all this? Conrad told him about Rust, about the spring, about the journal's final entries mentioning threats from developers. A company called Red Rock Ventures has been contacting me, pressuring me to sell. I think they pressured Vernon, too. Hank's jaw tightened. They've been buying up land around here for 3 years. Want to build some luxury resort. Bring in people with money who want to experience authentic dessert from air-conditioned casitas. They've been relentless. Do you know if they approached Vernon? I know they did. He told me about it. Said they were making his life hell. Phone calls at all hours, men showing up at his camp, veiled threats. Vernon was paranoid by then, maybe rightly so. He died before it came to a head. Hank looked at Conrad directly. They found him 3 weeks after his heart attack. Doctor said it was natural causes, Just stress and bad genetics and too much time living rough. But Vernon's last letter to Philip, the one the boy finally read after the funeral, mentioned being afraid for his safety. Conrad felt a chill despite the morning heat. You think someone... I don't think anything I can prove, Hank interrupted. But I know Vernon was healthy enough 6 months before he died. I know the pressure he was under. And I know Red Rock got most of the land they wanted eventually, from other sellers. Your 40 acres and the parcel Philip inherited from Vernon are the last 2 pieces they need. Philip inherited land from Vernon? The adjacent 40 acres, north of yours. Vernon left it to him in his will, along with a letter begging forgiveness. Philip pays the taxes on it, but won't set foot there. Says it's cursed ground where his father died alone, because Philip was too stubborn to answer his calls. Conrad thought about the spring, the canyon, the ancient petroglyphs. 80 acres total, split between 2 men who'd never met, connected by a dead man's attempt at redemption and a wild horse who'd chosen to stay. I need to meet Philip, Conrad said. Hank studied him for a long moment. Why? What are you planning? I don't know yet. But if Red Rock pressured Vernon, and now they're pressuring me, and if Philip owns the adjacent land, we need to talk. All of us who have something at stake here. Philip won't want to hear about his father. Then I'll talk about the horse, about the land, about what happens if we let them destroy it. Conrad pulled out his phone and showed Hank the text messages from Gregory Pendleton, the escalating offers, the urgent tone. They're not going to stop. Hank was quiet, then nodded slowly. Philip's shoeing horses at the Rafter Tea Ranch today. I'll call him, tell him to meet you. But Conrad... He fixed Conrad with a serious look. Be careful. Vernon thought he could fight them alone, and look what happened. These people have money and lawyers and patience. They'll wait you out or wear you down or find another way to get what they want. Maybe, Conrad said, but I'm not Vernon, and I'm not alone. He thought of Rust, waiting back at camp, of Laurel, worried but starting to understand, of the spring that had sustained life for centuries, of the petroglyphs that marked the land as sacred long before property lines were drawn. Set up the meeting, Conrad said. I'll be there. The Rafter Tea Ranch sat 20 miles west of Sunridge, a working cattle operation that sprawled across scrubland dotted with mesquite and palo verde. Conrad found Philip Castillo in the shoeing shed, bent over a bay gelding's hoof, working a rasp with steady, practiced strokes. He was in his early 40s, lean and weathered, with his uncle's sharp eyes, and a wariness that settled over him the moment he saw Conrad approach. He finished with the hoof, released the horse's leg gently, and straightened. You're the man who bought my father's land, Philip said. Not a question. The land next to it, yes. Conrad Lee. He extended his hand. Philip wiped his palm on his jeans before shaking, his grip firm and brief. Uncle Hank says you found some of my father's things. A journal, some photographs, one of you and a horse called Morning Star. Something flickered across Philip's face. Pain, or maybe longing for something lost. That was a long time ago. The horse I've been seeing, copper mare, wild. I think she's Morning Star's daughter. Philip set down his tools carefully, his movements controlled. Morning Star would be over 30 now, if she survived this long in the wild, which I doubt. But her daughter could have, Conrad pressed. Born wild, but carrying some memory of the place. Your father called the mare in his journal August. I've been calling her Rust. She comes to my camp every day, drinks from the spring in the North Canyon. The spring? Philip's voice went quiet. My father took me there when I was 15, said it was a sacred place, that the old people had known it for centuries. Then he lost everything, and I never saw it again. He bought that land trying to get back to it, trying to protect it. He bought that land trying to ease his guilt, Philip said sharply. Everything my father did in those last years was about making himself feel better about being a terrible parent. Forgive me if I'm not moved by his conservation efforts. Conrad absorbed the anger, recognized it as the flip side of grief. Your uncle told me you inherited the adjacent 40 acres. Land I'll never use and can't sell without feeling like I'm profiting from his death. Philip picked up his rasp again, the conversation clearly over in his mind. Red Rock Ventures contacted you too, didn't they? Philip's hand stilled. He didn't look up. 3 times. Offered good money. They're offering me 15,000, probably offering you the same or more. With both parcels, they'd have everything they need for their development. So sell, Philip said. Take the money and leave. That's what I'd do if I didn't have this guilt chained around my neck. Your father died fighting them. Now Philip did look up, his eyes hard. My father died alone of a heart attack because he spent his whole life making bad decisions and pushing away everyone who tried to help him. Don't romanticize it. Then help me understand something, Conrad said. In his journal, he wrote about threats, about men showing up at his camp, about being afraid. Was he paranoid, or was that real? Philip was quiet for a long moment. After he died, I found letters at his camp, from Red Rock's lawyers, from their representatives, each one more aggressive than the last. One mentioned that accidents happen in remote areas and elderly men living alone face numerous risks. Make of that what you will. I think my father had a bad heart and too much stress and died of natural causes, Philip interrupted. I also think Red Rock made his last months hell. Both things can be true. Conrad pulled out his phone and showed Philip the text messages from Gregory Pendleton, the escalating offers, the urgent pressure. They're doing the same to me. Philip studied the messages, his expression unreadable. Then sell. Don't make my mistake. Don't let pride or principle or whatever you want to call it trap you into fighting a battle you can't win. What if we fought it together? We don't know each other. No, but we both own something they want. And that spring, those petroglyphs. Your father was right. That land is worth protecting. Why do you care? Philip's question was genuine, not hostile. You've been out there, 3 weeks? You don't have history with that place. You don't owe my father anything. Conrad thought about how to answer. I came here with nothing. Lost my marriage, my business, my sense of who I was. That land, it's given me something I can't name yet. Purpose, maybe. Or just a reason to get up in the morning. The horse helped, too. She shows up and I remember I'm not completely alone. That's not enough to fight a development company with lawyers and resources. Maybe not. But your father tried to document the land's conservation's value, water sources, wildlife corridors. If we could prove the ecological significance, Philip shook his head. I'm not getting involved in this. You already are involved. You own half the puzzle they need. Then they can wait until I'm dead and buy it from my estate. Philip gathered his tools. I'm sorry, Mr. Lee. I understand what you're trying to do, but I spent my whole childhood watching my father fight losing battles, and I won't do it again. Some things aren't worth the cost. Conrad watched him walk away toward another horse, waiting to be shod, then drove back to his property, feeling the weight of failed possibility. But as he approached his camp, and saw Rust waiting near the rocks, her copper coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Something in him hardened into resolve. He wouldn't fight alone if that's what it took. Over the next week, Conrad threw himself into documenting everything Vernon had started. He installed wildlife cameras near the spring, capturing images of Rust and 2 other mustangs, a family of javelinas, even a bobcat drinking in the early morning. He photographed the petroglyphs from every angle. He tested the spring water. Clean, pure, vital. He called Laurel and explained what he was trying to do. To his surprise, she didn't argue. Instead, she said, "Let me make some calls. I know a paralegal who works with environmental groups. I can't pay anyone. Dad, just let me help." The help came in the form of contacts, information, legal precedents. Laurel sent him links to conservation easement requirements, contact information for Arizona wildlife organizations, examples of successful land protections. She even found a lawyer willing to consult for free, a woman named Patricia Hayes, who specialized in environmental law. If you can prove the land provides critical habitat or has significant historical value, you've got options, Patricia told him over a crackling phone connection. But you'll need documentation, scientific surveys, archaeological assessments. That takes time and money. How much time? Months. Maybe a year. I don't have a year. Red Rock is pushing now. Then you push back. Document everything, every contact they make. If they cross lines, harassment, trespassing, threats, you build a case. It won't stop them, but it might slow them down. Conrad thanked her and sat by his evening fire, thinking. Rust stood nearby, close enough now that he could hear her breathing, see the individual whiskers on her muzzle. Over the weeks, the distance between them had shrunk from 50 feet to 15, from wariness to something approaching companionship. "I need more time," he told her. "Time to prove this place matters." His phone buzzed. A new number, but the message was familiar in tone. "Mr. Lee, I'm standing on your property line. We should talk. Gregory Pendleton." Conrad stood slowly, adrenaline spiking. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the southern boundary, Rust following at a distance, alert to his tension. He found Pendleton exactly where he'd said, standing just outside the property markers, a tall man in expensive outdoor gear that had never seen real use, flanked by 2 others in casual clothes that didn't quite hide their security training. "Mr. Lee." Pendleton's smile was practiced, professional. "I apologize for the evening visit, but you haven't been responding to my messages. I've been busy. Living off-grid, I see. Admirable, in a way, but not sustainable." Pendleton gestured at the desert around them. "This is harsh country. A man your age alone, anything could happen." The words echoed Vernon's journal entries. Conrad felt Rust tense behind him, felt his own anger rise. "Are you threatening me? I'm expressing concern and making you one final offer. $25,000, more than fair for land that's essentially worthless." "Then why do you want it so badly?" Pendleton's smile thinned. "We're assembling a larger parcel. Your 40 acres represents a gap in our property holdings. We're prepared to be generous to close that gap." "I'm not selling. Everyone sells eventually, Mr. Lee. It's just a matter of price, or pressure." Pendleton glanced at the 2 men with him. "I'd hate to see something happen to your camp. Fire can spread quickly in this drought, or your water supply could become contaminated. Desert survival depends on so many fragile factors." Conrad took a step forward, putting himself clearly between Pendleton and Rust. "Get off my property line." "We're not on your property. We're on land we own, or will own shortly." Pendleton pulled out his phone, showed Conrad a document. That adjacent 40 acres. The owner just agreed to sell. We'll have the papers signed within the week. Conrad felt his stomach drop. Philip. Philip had given in. Once we own that parcel, your little holdout becomes an island surrounded by our development. No road access except through our property. We'll make your life very difficult, Mr. Lee. Behind Conrad, Rust snorted and stamped, agitated. Pendleton's eyes shifted to her, and something calculating entered his expression. Wild horses are regulated by BLM, you know. If we report a dangerous animal on our property line, one that poses a threat to our workers, they'll round her up. She'll end up in a holding facility or worse. The threat to Rust snapped something in Conrad. Touch that horse and You'll what? Pendleton's professional veneer cracked slightly, showing the hardness beneath. You're an old man living illegally on unimproved land with no utilities and probably no permits. One call to county code enforcement and they'll evict you. We've been patient, Mr. Lee. Don't mistake patience for weakness. The three men turned and walked back toward vehicles Conrad could now see parked in the darkness beyond the property line. Their headlights flared to life, sweeping across the desert before driving away. Conrad stood trembling with rage and fear, Rust pressing closer to him than she'd ever come before, seeking reassurance or offering it. He couldn't tell which. His phone rang. Philip. Don't believe him, Philip said without preamble. I haven't sold. I wouldn't. His voice caught. I couldn't do that to my father's memory, no matter how complicated our relationship was. Pendleton's bluffing. Conrad felt relief wash through him. He threatened the horse, said he'd have her rounded up. Silence on the line. Then, tomorrow, meet me at the spring. We need to talk about how to fight this properly. Conrad didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, watching for headlights, listening for engines. Rust stayed close, restless, circling the camp perimeter like a sentinel. Every sound made them both tense. The skitter of a lizard, the distant howl of coyotes, the wind rattling through dry brush. At first light, he hiked to the spring to meet Philip. He found him already there, sitting on the flat rock where Conrad had first discovered the petroglyphs, Hank standing beside him. Both men looked grim. They're escalating, Philip said without greeting. After Pendleton visited you, he called me, said if I didn't sell by Friday, they'd find another way. Then he mentioned the horse specifically, said wild animals on disputed property lines often get hurt in accidents. Conrad felt his jaw tighten. They're threatening Rust directly now. Not just threatening. Hank pulled out his phone, showed Conrad a photo he'd taken at dawn. Found this at the spring entrance. The image showed fresh tire tracks and boot prints, clearly from overnight. Someone had been here while Conrad kept watch at his camp. They're scouting, Philip said. Learning the land, finding access points. Next step is action. Conrad looked around the canyon, this hidden place that had sustained life for centuries, and felt a desperate need to protect it. We need to document everything, get evidence of their harassment. Already started. Philip pulled out a small device from his pack, trail camera with motion sensor. I'm putting 3 around the property. 1 here, 1 at your camp boundary, 1 at the access road. Anything that moves, we'll have footage. Will that be enough? For what? A lawsuit we can't afford? Criminal charges we can't prove? Philip's voice was bitter. My father tried documentation. He had letters, recordings, witness statements. Died alone, anyway. Then what do we do? Hank spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of years. We make noise. Local news, social media, environmental groups. Make it expensive for them to play dirty. These developers care about their reputation. Bad publicity costs money. My daughter has contacts, Conrad said. Lawyers, paralegals, people who work with conservation groups. And I know ranchers, Philip added, people who depend on these water sources, who understand what development does to wildlife corridors. We're not alone in this, even if it feels that way. They spent the morning installing cameras and photographing everything, the spring, the petroglyphs, the evidence of overnight intrusion. Rust appeared at the canyon rim, watching them work, and Philip stopped mid-motion when he saw her. She looks like Morningstar, he said quietly. Same build, same coloring, even the way she holds her head. Your father thought she was Morningstar's daughter. My father thought a lot of things, but Philip's voice had lost its sharp edge. He watched Rust descend into the canyon, moving with familiar ease, and something in his expression softened. He was right about this place, though. It matters. Conrad seized the opening. Then help me protect it. Not for your father, for this. He gestured at the spring, at Rust drinking from the ancient pool, for what it represents. Philip was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Okay, but we do this smart. No heroics, no confrontations we can't win. We build a case, we make noise, and we don't give them any legal ammunition to use against us. They were sealing their plan when Conrad's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Just a photo. His blood ran cold when he opened it. The image showed Rust, clearly taken that morning from somewhere on the property. Zoomed in, professional quality. And attached to her mane, barely visible, was something small and dark. They tagged her, Conrad breathed. Philip looked at the photo and cursed. A tracking device. They'd been following her movements. Hank's face went pale. If they know where she goes, where she waters, where she feels safe. Conrad was already moving, climbing out of the canyon, calling for Rust. The mare's head lifted, ears swiveling toward his voice. She was 30 yards away, grazing near a creosote bush. He approached slowly, speaking softly, using every lesson the past weeks had taught him. Easy, girl. Let me help. I need you to trust me now. Rust's eyes showed white at the edges. She could sense his agitation, the tension rolling off him in waves. She took 2 steps back, muscles bunching to run. Please, Conrad whispered. Please don't run. He sat down in the sand, making himself small, non-threatening, pulled out a handful of the dried grass she liked, extended his hand, and waited. Behind him, Philip and Hank emerged from the canyon, but held back, giving Conrad space. Rust watched him, torn between flight and the trust they'd built over weeks of patient contact. Conrad could see the decision playing out in her body language, the tension, the readiness to bolt, but also the curiosity, the learned response to his voice. I won't hurt you, he said. I promise. Just let me get close enough to help. The mare took 1 tentative step forward, then another. It took an hour of Conrad sitting motionless while Rust circled him, approached and retreated, tested the air between them with flared nostrils. An hour of Philip and Hank standing silent as statues 50 yards away, barely breathing. An hour of desert heat climbing toward noon, sweat soaking Conrad's shirt, his legs cramping from stillness. But finally, Rust came close enough that Conrad could see the device clearly, a small GPS tracker zip-tied into her mane, hidden among the coarse hair. She lowered her head to sniff his extended hand, and Conrad moved with glacial slowness, reaching up toward her neck. She tensed but didn't bolt. His fingers found the tracker, felt the plastic tie. He'd need both hands to remove it, and that meant standing, moving, risking everything they'd built. Just a little longer, he murmured. Almost done. He rose inch by inch, keeping his movements fluid and predictable. Rust's breathing quickened, but she held her ground. Conrad got his other hand up, found the tracker's attachment point, and with a quick twist snapped the zip tie. The device came free. Rust jumped back 3 feet, snorting, but she didn't run. Conrad held up the tracker so she could see it, as if showing her the threat he'd removed, then crushed it under his boot heel. "There," he said. "You're free." Rust shook her head, mane flying, then did something she'd never done before. She stepped forward and pressed her muzzle briefly against Conrad's chest. Just a moment of contact, warm breath and soft whiskers, before she pulled away and trotted toward the canyon. Conrad stood shaking, adrenaline and emotion flooding through him. That brief touch felt like absolution, like trust earned and given freely. "I'll be damned," Philip said, approaching slowly. "She let you. I've never seen a Mustang allow that kind of contact after being caught." "We weren't catching her," Conrad said. "We were helping her. She knows the difference." They returned to Conrad's camp to find a county sheriff's vehicle parked at the property line. Deputy Louise Freeman leaned against the hood, waiting. She was in her 50s, weathered and competent-looking, with eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Lee?" she called. "Need to have a word." Conrad's stomach knotted. "What's this about?" "Got a complaint from Red Rock Ventures. They're claiming you've been trespassing on their adjacent property, harassing their survey crews, and threatening violence." She pulled out a notepad. "They've also filed for a restraining order requiring you to stay 100 yards from any of their personnel." "That's a lie," Conrad said. "They've been the ones harassing me, coming to my camp at night, making threats." "Do you have evidence of that?" Conrad thought of the trail cameras they'd just installed, the documentation they'd only started gathering. "Working on it." Freeman's expression suggested she'd heard that before. "Look, I don't care much for developers coming in and changing things, but I care less for vigilante justice. Red Rock has lawyers and deep pockets. You try to fight them without proof, you'll lose more than this land." "What if we had proof?" Philip stepped forward. "Of trespassing, harassment, threats to livestock and wildlife?" Freeman studied him. "You're the Castillo boy." "Philip." "Yes, ma'am." "Your daddy's land is caught up in this mess too, isn't it?" "Was my daddy's land. Mine now. And yes, Red Rock wants it." Freeman was quiet for a moment, then closed her notepad. "I'm required to deliver this complaint and advise you to comply with all laws, which I've done. But off the record, start documenting everything. Times, dates, photos, witnesses. Build a case that can stand up in court, because that's where this is heading." She handed Conrad a business card. "You get solid evidence of criminal harassment or trespassing, you call me directly. Not the main line, me." After she left, Conrad sat heavily on his camp chair. The situation had escalated beyond simple pressure. Red Rock was using the legal system now, boxing him in with restraining orders and complaints. His phone rang. Laurel. "Dad, I've been doing research. There's a conservation group in Phoenix that specializes in desert habitat protection. I sent them everything you documented, the photos, the water tests, the wildlife footage. They're interested." "How interested?" "Interested enough to fast-track an emergency conservation easement review. If they determine the land has significant ecological value, they can help you file for protected status. It won't stop Red Rock completely, but it gives you legal standing to fight." Conrad felt a flicker of hope. "How long does the review take?" 2 weeks minimum. They need to send someone out to assess the site, verify your documentation, probably do additional surveys. "We might not have 2 weeks. "Then you make the time, Dad. You hold the line until help arrives." Her voice strengthened. I'm proud of you, by the way, for not giving up, for fighting for something that matters. After the call, Conrad looked at Philip. 2 weeks. Can we last 2 weeks? Philip gazed toward the canyon where Rust had disappeared. With help? Maybe. My uncle has friends, other ranchers who've dealt with developers. I'll make calls. And I'll keep documenting. Conrad thought of Vernon's journal, of a man who died trying to protect this place alone. But we do it together. No more fighting solo battles. Philip extended his hand. Together. They shook on it as the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold, beautiful and harsh and worth every risk. 2 months had passed since the confrontation with Pendleton, and the desert had transformed Conrad in ways he was still discovering. The conservation group's assessment had come through in 18 days, 4 days longer than hoped, but faster than expected. Their findings were clear. The spring represented a critical water source in an increasingly arid corridor. The petroglyphs held archaeological significance, and the wildlife usage patterns documented by Conrad's cameras proved the land's ecological value. The emergency conservation easement had been approved, protecting the land in perpetuity from commercial development. Red Rock Ventures had made one final legal push, but without both parcels they needed, their resort plans collapsed. Pendleton had stopped calling. The threats had ended. The land was safe. Conrad had built a proper cabin now, small but solid, with Philip's help and Hank's supervision. It sat near the original camp spot, positioned to catch the morning sun and afternoon shade from the rock formation. Solar panels on the roof powered a mini-fridge and charging station. A rainwater collection system supplemented the spring. It wasn't luxury, but it was home. Rust came and went as she pleased, sometimes daily, sometimes absent for 3 or 4 days before returning. She'd brought another horse with her last week, a younger Mustang, skittish and wild. Conrad had watched from his porch as Rust led the newcomer to the water tub, teaching by example that this place was safe. Philip visited every Sunday now, often staying for dinner, sharing stories about his farrier work, and slowly, carefully, stories about Vernon. The anger had softened into something more complex, grief mixed with understanding, resentment tempered by time. They'd built a memorial at the spring, a simple stone marker with Vernon's name and dates, and below it, he tried to protect what mattered. Philip had chosen the words, and Conrad thought Vernon would have appreciated their honesty. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled Conrad from his thoughts. He recognized the rental car. Laurel had texted that morning, saying she was bringing someone. His son climbed out of the passenger side. Conrad stood slowly from his porch chair, heart hammering. Brent looked older than he had 6 months ago, harder somehow, but his eyes held uncertainty rather than anger. "Dad," Brent said. "Son." They stood 15 feet apart, the desert silence heavy between them. Laurel stayed by the car, giving them space. "Laurel wouldn't stop talking about this place," Brent finally said. "About what you'd done, how you'd fought to protect it." Thought she was exaggerating. He looked around at the cabin, the solar panels, the organized camp. "Guess she wasn't. I'm glad you came. I'm not sure I am yet." Brent's honesty was familiar. He'd always been direct, even as a child. "I was angry, Dad. Am angry. You left. Right when everything fell apart, you just left." "I did," Conrad admitted. "I ran. I was broken and didn't know how to fix myself around people who'd known me as something else. So I came here." He gestured at the land. "Found out I needed to be alone to remember who I was." "And who are you?" Conrad considered the question. "Still figuring that out. But I'm not the man who lost everything anymore. I'm the man who built something new." Movement caught both their eyes. Rust appeared from behind the rocks, walking calmly toward the water tub. Brent tensed, but Conrad stayed relaxed. That's her? The wild horse? That's Rust. They watched in silence as she drank, then raised her head to study them. Her ears swiveled forward, curious but unafraid. She just comes here. Every few days. Sometimes brings friends. Conrad smiled. Took 6 weeks before she'd let me touch her. Now she trusts this is a safe place. Brent looked at his father, something shifting in his expression. Laurel said you fought a development company, that you could have sold for good money but chose this instead. Some things matter more than money. Mum doesn't see it that way. She thinks you're crazy, hiding from responsibility. Conrad felt the old defensiveness rise, then let it go. Your mother's entitled to her opinion. So are you. But I'm not hiding anymore. I'm living. There's a difference. Rust finished drinking and approached closer than usual, perhaps drawn by the new presence. She stopped 10 feet away, regarding Brent with calm assessment. Can I? Brent hesitated. Can I try to get closer? Sit down first. Make yourself small. Let her decide. Father and son sat in the dirt, and Conrad talked Brent through the patience required, the waiting, the respect for the horse's autonomy. Rust watched them, head tilted, processing. After 20 minutes, she took 3 steps closer. She's deciding if you're safe, Conrad said softly. How do you know? Experience, time, paying attention. He glanced at his son. Same way people decide, I suppose, given enough patience. Rust didn't come all the way, but she didn't leave either. She settled into grazing nearby, comfortable enough with their presence to stay. Laurel joined them eventually, sitting on Conrad's other side. The 3 of them watched the sun descend toward the western hills, painting the sky in impossible colors. You can stay the night if you want, Conrad offered. It's not comfortable, but there's space. Brent was quiet for a long moment. Maybe next time. This time I just wanted to... He struggled for words. I wanted to see if you were okay. I am, Conrad said. Better than okay. Yeah. Brent nodded slowly. I can see that. They left at dusk, Brent promising to call, Laurel hugging Conrad tight and whispering, he'll come around, give him time. Alone again, Conrad sat by his evening fire, Rust a dark silhouette against the deepening sky. His phone held photos now, of Laurel smiling in front of the cabin, of Brent sitting in the dirt trying to earn a wild horse's trust, of family fractured but healing. He'd come here with $20 and nothing left to lose. He'd found a horse who'd taught him patience, a purpose worth defending, and the beginnings of reconciliation with the people he loved. The land hadn't saved him. The choice to honor it, to fight for it, to build something worth keeping, that had saved him. Rust wandered closer, allowed Conrad to rest his hand briefly on her neck, then moved away into the darkness. Free, wild and choosing to return, just like him.